Hello, and welcome to Cape Breton University and the Rotary Music Performance Room at the Center for Cape Breton Studies. This is a room that was built in 2006, opened officially in 2007 at the Center for Cape Breton Studies, when Richard MacKinnon, who's the author of today's article, built the music room and the digitization lab, which is through the windows behind me, as part of his Canada Research Chair in Intangible Cultural Heritage here. And when he got that chair, that's what instigated my hiring and the hiring of Heather Sparling and the beginning of Folklore as a program, as opposed to as a series of courses that he'd been offering for really the better part of 20 years. And so, yeah, I thought this would be a good place to film today. And his reading, what we're talking about, is Public Image and Private Reality in Cape Breton Folk Traditions. You might see that it's actually called Postscript. This is the last chapter, what became the last chapter in Discovering Cape Breton Folklore, which was basically a compilation of Richard's greatest hits. And this was written in 1990, but originally, as it indicates, but the book was published in 2009 or 2010, just off the top of my head. And yeah, so this could serve as an introduction to Cape Breton tradition and culture, and this could serve as the conclusion. Because what we've got is a fairly nice summation, and written for a general audience, a fairly nice summation of the double bind that folklorists face themselves, or find themselves in, and have to encounter. So basically, what we've got here is this notion that culture is a thing. Culture will exist. Culture springs up. I mean, in a way, I don't know if anyone's expressed it this way, but this thing, let's just call it folklore, although it manifests itself ultimately in many different ways that even a folklorist would have a difficulty calling folklore. But if it begins with the idea that there are ways that we communicate to each other that are as based on a sense of aesthetics and based on a sense of continuity with the past and based on a sense that these things, as odd as they might be, are ours, and that we do them with deliberate purpose, folklore is going to exist. So we can look at it from an anthropological viewpoint, we can look at it from a very historical viewpoint, and it's kind of always there. It sometimes gets overshadowed by popular culture and elite culture. It's something that might be left behind. It's something that might be ignored. It's something that might be disdained because it is so ephemeral, because it is so because it's tied to place, because of its informality. And more than anything, it's not informal because the people themselves are informal. It's informal because it is about the moment and the now, and the being present to each other, where formality, and I know I'm kind of blurring the lines of what I mean by formality, but formality is kind of unnecessary in those circumstances. That it suffices, and it suffices because the act itself is an act of communion, whatever the content of that act might be. But then we have this situation, and that obviously one of the things that happens with folk culture is that sometimes when we've been overwhelmed by popular culture, we've been overwhelmed by elite culture, and that popular culture and that elite culture come from other places, often. And something happens. Something happens to that sense of identity that is lost, especially when those comforts are no longer in place. So one of the things that happens with folk revivals, or one of the things that might cause a return to the idea of let's concentrate on this thing, on this peculiar thing, this thing that we often ignore, the thing that we often disdain and leave behind, is this sense that the promises of higher culture, the promises of popular culture have kind of failed us. So we see that, for example, in moments of, because you can't extricate your current circumstances from the performances and cultural forms that are present in it. So folklore had its origins as a discipline. So folkloristics has its origins as a discipline. People make arbitrary, talk about Herodotus and a sort of anthropological study and so on, but basically it's a post-Napoleonic war, early industrialization, moment of existential terror, where you had the beginnings of empire. You had the beginnings of creating these new nation states. You had the beginnings of mass slaughter, and you had the beginning of a shift to urbanism. And this sense of we don't necessarily know who we are anymore. You have these two moments. One of them is this idea of romantic nationalism, where, and you see that in the English folklorists and the German folklorists and so on, this sense that we have been defined by being the middle class, by being well educated and following what our culture has told us to be this sort of natural form of, or not natural, but preordained form of sort of power and strength. We have been modeling ourselves on the cultures of other people, on the Greeks, on the Romans, primarily, and then subsequently on the French and the Italian. But that is not who we are. So we're now a global superpower, an economic superpower, and yet we're still defining ourselves, and defining ourselves negatively, like as poor cousins to these other cultures, when our culture is just as good. And so you had this great flourish of the study of German traditions, of English traditions, of Scandinavian traditions, and this sort of upswell that happened. And the other time that it emerges is similar existential moments, when economies collapse or when certainties collapse. So you see that, I mean, we can talk about various revolutionary moments that were then followed by a return to the folk. An interesting one is the New Culture movement in China. So you had the Boxer Rebellion in 1904, and basically the end of imperial China. And so they were a modern country, as it were. Or at least, they weren't under sort of the Mandarin society of 19th century and all the dynastic rule that went prior to that. And they were participants in World War I, and the promises were made to them and promises were betrayed. And you had like the May 4th moment in the Paris peace talks, where basically all the promises that were made to China were tossed away. And this real sort of moment of national despair for one of the world's, at the time, still the world's largest country. But who are we? And in the mid-1920s, you had the New Culture movement. That was this artistic but also political moment that was about recognizing that China was still defining itself on the level of language, on the level of literature, on the level of song, on the level of art, defining itself as this imperial nation, this Mandarin Chinese, and that what we need to sort of Mandarin in terms of the sort of functionaries within the court, not Mandarin as in the as opposed to Cantonese. I was talking about China. Yes, right. And so the movement was that we need to, almost in Eliot's terms, purify the dialect of the tribe, and that we need to go to where the spirit of place is. We need to find out what it means to be actually Chinese, not this vassal state of empire that no longer exists, of the old Chinese dynastic court, but actually of the folk, of the peasants, that being the terminology at the time. And so the New Culture movement was this vast folklore exercise of collecting song and collecting story, and basically recreating a literature and a culture based on real people, the folk, themselves, sort of throughout that cultural moment. You see that in the 1920s again in the United States, in the 1930s really, where you had after, when you have the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and all that despair that happened at the time. I mean, some of it was a make-work project, but there was a lot of movement of going out and collecting folk song and collecting story, and that's how Woody Guthrie emerged. That's how Hetty Ledbetter came on the scene. That's the great work of the Lomaxes, and the American Folklife Center was, I don't think it was formed then, but Library of Congress was involved in this, and Works Progress Administration, and it was going out and basically collecting American folk song at a time when, again, our culture had failed us. You see it again in the 1950s and the 1960s when you had economic prosperity, but you had the existential moments of post-World War II, post-Hiroshima, post-Holocaust, and the culture of fear that was also present in this culture of optimism. And so the folk revival of the 50s and 60s and the return to the authenticity was in stark contrast. And I have always argued that you have it starting in the 1970s in Cape Breton with the end of coal and steel, and that Cape Breton had defined itself largely as focused on the eastern part of the island because of its industry, understood itself as an industrial place, as sort of forward-looking, coal and steel and prosperity, and one of Canada's great contributors to its own industrial economic well-being. And then coal and steel basically the indication was there that it was collapsing. And it was in the 1970s when you had this moment of, if we are not industry, who are we? And that's when you have things like the documentary about the vanishing Cape Breton fiddler. That's where you have these moments of cultural, start using Richard's terms, intervention, of these things that were in danger of being lost are now going to be found. You have also other really interesting artistic movements in terms of alternative theater, beginning of sort of contemporary art, the beginning of underground comic books, rock, punk, well, punk not early 70s, but late 70s. You have those thriving activities as well, but you also had this groundswell of who we are. And so we have this we kind of have this tension, these two tensions. One is we all exist in these sort of folk culture manners, but we also are active participants in popular culture and high culture. And there's this tendency of dichotomizing those. There's this tendency of saving one for particular spheres of activity and saving one for other spheres of activity. And the second one is when we take this stuff of who we are and we make it that much more weighted, where we turn it into this moment of, we come to it in this moment of crisis, like who we are, who are we, what do we do? And I think that's what Richard is talking about here, implicitly or explicitly or not. So, so we have this culture that surrounds us, that exists in Cape Breton, whether it is of whatever form it takes. And we can see patterns, and we're familiar with it, and we're fluent with it because we live in it in the day-to-day. And I'm being very bold by saying we. I know I am a come from away. But the same would be true basically everywhere, because folklore, of course, exists everywhere. It is not a Cape Breton or a fraught region-specific activity. It's just sometimes we don't advert attention to it. There's a new article that's coming out. It's a chapter that just came out in a book by Jody McDavid, and it is about the development of this program. And the title is "This is a Good Place for It." This notion that Cape Breton is distinct because it has folklore. It's like, no, everywhere has folklore. Cape Breton is distinct because attention is paid towards it, because this sense of tradition has been forefronted as opposed to being something that we just float in. So we're fluent with this walk around, this existence, as we can live in the day to day, and we know how to code and talk to people, and even using code seems like it's disingenuous, but you just know how to be. You maintain a sort of basic cultural fluency of walking through the world. And then we have this thing called, which we might just put in quotes, Cape Breton culture. We have this thing that is leveled and layered with an additional level of meaning for some reason. He uses the word interveners and intervention. David Wisnet's work on All That Is Native and Fine is basically this notion that there are people who have recognized, for whatever purpose, whether it's political, whether it's economic, whether it is their own existential concerns, but they wield a certain amount of power. These interveners who basically crystallize the culture, take a snapshot of what they think is the authentic, and snapshot isn't a bad metaphor because it is bounded. Everything that falls within the photograph is the things that fall outside the photograph are not. So it's kind of bordered. And they shape this definition of culture according to their own purposes. And we see that on and time and again. So what we have is this sort of strange dichotomy, because we can take this idea of, I'm using dichotomy twice, and that's just lazy of me, but we have the strange dilemma, that's really the word I'm thinking of, in that if we take this notion of these interventions, these moments that have been enshrined with value, we can sort of do that framing that I just suggested with the metaphor of the photograph, where this is the thing and this is the other thing. And what we're really doing in this aspect, we could be saying this is inauthentic because it is a process of intervention, and this is authentic because it is not. And that doesn't really help matters either, because there are things that are caught in that intervention, as it were, things that have been promoted and crystallized and maintained, and perhaps even given the imprimatur of the state and so on, that are nevertheless something that we might recognize as having value. That it's not a matter of it being incorrect that this is something that we can mark as an identity, mark as part of our identity work, mark as something that we are fluent with, but it doesn't exhaust it. So this isn't necessarily better or worse than over here, the things that have not been captured in the intervention. But rather than using that inauthentic and authentic, he suggests this idea of basically public and private. This is the thing that we are presenting when we are presenting it to an outsider. When we really need to consolidate and double down is that this is who we are for whatever purpose. Again, whether as a form of economics, folklore, whatever we want to do, this is the kind of stuff that we get to see. And this is the kind of stuff that is sometimes most encouraged for its promotion, for its documentation. These are the things. When my students are talking about what they want to do for their final assignments, they're like, is it okay if I do this thing? And they've gone through the entire course and they're like, well, this is a Cape Breton thing, but it doesn't seem to, they're not using these words, but really they're saying it doesn't fit in this box. So can I talk about this? And it's like, yes, you can, because it's in that sort of private reality. And the fact that you even ask that question is kind of fascinating. The fact that something that is that you're aware of, that you know it to be found meaningful, if not to you, then at least to someone else, that takes place in Cape Breton, that involves Cape Bretoners, the fact that you see that it doesn't fit into this box, whether this box is something that you, I keep on using this box metaphor and I've walked into a corner, whether you can fully articulate the parameters of this box, the fact that you're even asking questions about it is asking questions about the nature of these two tensions. So this is the stuff we do when we are being intentionally Cape Breton-y. And this is the stuff we do when we are not reflexive, when we just are. when we go back, basically, to that thing that I talked about at the very beginning of this, that folklore just something, it's the expressive performances that we do. And it's not that we are unthinking, it's just that we are not concerned with justifying it as a outlay of energy and time and devotion, because it is meaningful, because it is meaningful. It doesn't need an outside audience to validate it. It doesn't need to be justified by any measure. And that is the stuff, fundamentally, this is the stuff that generations hence start to be put in this box. And that's really one of the fascinating things about folklore, and one of the reasons why it's good to document culture across the board, because you never know when it is, when the interveners are going to need their data, are going to need this stuff. I mean, that's the big irony, in that these are the things that are meaningful to us. These are the things that are upon which communities are built, communities of common purpose, communities of common reference, communities of care are built on these very private interactions. Not private, but just not public and presented. These very interpersonal interactions. And they are the things that are in our active repertoire. Oh my God, I'm just tying in the active and inactive repertoire on the cultural level. This is good. You might not understand it, but trust me, this is brilliant. That was pretty vain of me, but there we go. So it's something that is, we're fluent with it. And then communities change because it's shifting, because it isn't, it is grounded by the fact that because it doesn't have to meet some kind of objective measurement, it just is going to be. It just is. It exists within the collective memory of the group until it doesn't exist within the collective memory of the group, until something else pushes it out. And it's fine that it does. And then we have these moments, these same existential moments, where all of a sudden we are in our 60s and we're like, I don't remember, or I can't get this thing. So I've been talking on the cultural level, but then I'm thinking on the personal level. I can't remember these things. Think about, here's a good analogy. Think about recipes. Think about your grandmother's biscuits or your grandmother's cookies or something. Gendered example, I know, but here we are. Where you have something that she knew how to make. She knew how to make because she had been making it her entire life. She knew how to make it for you because she understood your tastes, and she didn't necessarily have that recipe written down because she was an expert enough baker in order to, throw the ingredients together and put them in the oven for the right amount of time, and they come out perfect, exactly how you want them. They're perfect in a way that you don't necessarily recognize that they are perfect at the time. They just are. And then your grandmother dies. Sorry. Your grandmother dies, now you're an old man or an old woman, and you want the taste of your grandmother's cookies and it isn't written down. And all of a sudden those grandmother's cookies become reminiscent of the past, that sort of lost, ephemeral, immediate performances that are gone. Now think of that on a larger scale. Think of what happened when we look at when in the 1920s the Americans were collecting folk songs. If we don't collect this now, if we don't go to the places where it is still happening, this collective creativity might be lost, and somewhere within this collective creativity are the things that we understand as being important and of value. One of the reasons why it is useful to collect, and folklore is not just collecting, it's about documenting, it's about contextualizing, it's about understanding, and it's about recognizing what's happening when we collectively as the folk are doing this thing. But there is this, it is the stuff that we find meaningful, and we don't recognize that how meaningful it is until it is absent. And all of a sudden I seem to be romanticizing it. And it's almost difficult not to. And I try not to poke it because, quite frankly, that's a sort of fairly glamorous way of looking at it. But it's also, of course, it's in these folk cultures where we have, and I'll use we just in terms of folk and not specify Cape Breton specifically, but we have our racist and our sexist and our heterocentric and our classist impulses. Those expressions of carving ourselves out into something that is often in distinction from something else and helps to maintain cohesion through opposition, cohesion through vilifying others and creating this in and out, or this insider and outsider. So we don't want to romanticize all the products, that this is necessarily the products of a purely good culture or a purely good people. We want to recognize that these are forms. It's also one of the reasons why sometimes it's difficult when we have people like, when we have certain folklorists who had this romantic idea of the past, and as they go out and collect, they fundamentally, as it were, cherry pick. They take these, they take what they think of as authentic because it reflects this romantic idea of the past, and they leave behind what they think is inauthentic because it deals with sex and violence and economic problems and labor and all these things that would just, when we are interveners, it just confuses us. So that's why I can quickly move away from that romantic aspect. But those negative things inform us as well, inform our identity, and help to explain how things happen. Henry Glassy, folklorist Henry Glassy, once wrote this article about sort of about tradition, what we mean when we use the word tradition. It's in the keywords issue of Journal of American Folklore, and basically he sort of suggested that tradition are that strange thing that happens between these moments of history, and that if history is basically, as understood by historians, is typically as these moments of events that you can trace as the things that go from A to B to C that change the trajectory of a people. What happens in the spaces in between, where these moments that are between these moments of change, they are also often the things that occasion these moments of change. They are the background in which these moments of change occur. So, but because they do not necessarily deal with seismic events, they just deal with quotidian life, we need to sort of unpack what that day-to-day is, and we often only really have these sort of expressive forms. Because if folklore is the study of everyday life, if folklore is the study of informal culture, informal and everyday life is what is the fundamental background to formal and non-everyday life. Yeah. So one of the things that we can think about in terms of how to distinguish these publics and privates, there's a concept called the rites of passage. Arnold Van Gennep, a French folklorist, basically came up with a structure of how one moves from one status in life to another within a social context, including such statuses of going from being unborn to born and from alive to dead, but childhood to adulthood, fertile to infertile, non-fertile to fertile, single to married, not having graduated to graduated. It's not all traditional forms. In fact, the contemporary rite of passage takes its form based on the more traditional rites of passage, which tend to have to do with biological development, like birth and menstruation and a whole bunch of stuff. But we also have what's sometimes called rites of intensification. We see that in festivals. We see that in moments. We see that in family celebrations, where people gather together and through expressive forms reaffirm their sense of identity to each other. And you can make an argument that there are public and private rites of intensification, and that there's things like, big things like the Celtic Colors Festival, which is sort of very much a public rite of intensification. We're gathering together and we're going to celebrate all these things that make Celtic music and a thing, and Cape Breton the place for it. It's wonderful, and it's a thing, but it's very outward looking. It's very to be seen. And then there are and then sort of think of the kind of foods that might get served there. Think of the kind of music that gets played there. And then there is the more private rites of intensification. And you can now just think of things like what happens in the home or what happens among friends. And they are, the music might actually be the same, but it's the same because we choose it to be, not because some intervener has more or less curated it. And the food might be the same, but it's not the same because a culinary tourism expert has suggested what would be most suitable for the occasion. And so the rite of intensification are these moments when we get together and for no other purpose. You can make an argument that it's functional. Functionalism be damned. It works. But people get together and they are just reaffirming their co-presence to each other, reaffirming their sense of mutual participation in living, or mutual participation in being in the world together at the same time. And those are the times when these cultural performances, they are at their most natural and spontaneous, that the rites are almost by definition take place in sort of ludic times. They are at least expressly different from periods of work. And although a lot of labor goes into making them, they are different from our everyday understanding of work. And they are moments when we are being. And so we have this final sense of what Richard is talking about in these sort of two moments, this public and this private. It's not real versus, it's not inauthentic versus authentic. It is this matter of what we are doing when we have no other stakes in how we choose to perform, save for the fact that we know that the people who are present to us will find it just as meaningful as we do. And yes, it overlaps. Often it overlaps. And they are seen as contiguous, because they are contiguous. It is, again, the rite of intensification has, not the rite of intensification, the private reality has as much moments of inauthenticity in it as the public has authentic. Because the private moment doesn't care. It's question about what is authentic and not. The intervention is often framed as being authentic. And then we can criticize it by being wholly a construct, or at least through a selective process. That's just why we hate the word authentic, because it's dumb. But the folk use whatever is at their disposal to find meaning to each other. Often what's at their disposal is the precedent that's immediately around them. So it is their language, it is their landscape, it is their shared experiences, it is their shared history, it is their shared ethnic heritage, it's their shared socio-cultural heritage, it's their shared participation in traditions of occupation. All of that is fine, but all of that is just pools of meaning that are brought together to create an individual and distinct performance at any given moment. It's also our fan communities. It's also our understanding of the digital world. It's our understanding of pop culture. It's our understanding of classical culture. It's whatever we choose because there are no arbiters of authenticity there. There is no intervention. There are no gatekeepers. And that is when culture is at its most interesting. And it should be, because it's messy, because it's not bounded, it's more difficult to study. But it is the study of undifferentiated consciousness, to use Lonergan's terms. And I think that's kind of cool. I didn't really summarize Richard's thing at all. He has this wonderful example where he contrasts the he contrasts a lot of the Highland Games stuff, which is definitely a celebration of Cape Breton culture, but through these multiple filters of intervention, as opposed to a house raising, which is just as a traditional event, just as much as a group coming together to reaffirm their co-presence and their interrelations to each other, that has song and laughter and all sorts of expressive forms that aren't necessarily central but are nevertheless present. And so that's a really great description of the kind of processes that we're talking about. So once more, fundamentally, the article, Public Image and Private Reality in Cape Breton Folk Traditions, it can serve as a conclusion, it can serve as an introduction, and they are, these two aspects, they are not, Cape Breton becomes an interesting place for this to have happened. It's an interesting field site because that dichotomous nature has happened. What I talked about earlier, in that we seem to have this, first this sort of rigid division between folk tradition and popular culture and high culture, wrought by economic uncertainty, and then we have that division, and then we have this division of folk culture into this false dichotomy of this false dichotomy, but a dichotomy that exists nonetheless, of the things that have upon which intervention has happened and then they become crystallized, and the things that haven't, and that public and private. So we see it. We have entire centers, we have entire careers that are predicated on the idea that some of these things should be studied. And we also have entire careers that are in jeopardy because of the idea that some of these things should not be studied. So Cape Breton becomes this fascinating case for it. That being said, this happens everywhere. Sometimes we are very reflective of our identity, and sometimes we just are. And it's an interesting way of being in the world. All right, my friends, that is it. This is the Center for Cape Breton Studies, your tax dollars at work. As ever, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well. Bye-bye.